In a village where words held power and silence was often more dangerous than screams, there stood a house that people called the House of Silence. From its walls, no laughter escaped, no music lingered, and no joy was ever shared. It was a home where whispers were sharper than knives, where every word spoken seemed to echo longer than it should, carrying secrets and fears into corners that never forgot. Within those walls lived a young girl whose voice was unlike anything the village had ever heard. Her singing was not just pleasant, it carried a purity that seemed to wash over hearts and soften even the hardest of moods. When she sang at the riverbank while fetching water, the birds would grow quiet as if listening. When she hummed through her chores, weary neighbors would stop for a moment, their burdens feeling lighter. Her voice was not only her gift but her entire identity, for it was the one thing that kept her spirit alive in a household that offered her no kindness. But in the shadows of that same house, another spirit festered, one filled with envy and hatred. The girl's stepmother, a woman hardened by greed and suspicion, could not bear the way people spoke of the girl's voice. To the villagers, the girl was a light in a place of darkness, but to the stepmother, every note was a reminder of her own insignificance. The more the girl sang, the deeper the resentment grew. Each compliment from outsiders was a thorn in her flesh. Each smile the girl received was another reason to despise her. The stepmother saw the girl singing not as a blessing, but as a threat to her authority, her control, and her own twisted sense of pride. The house itself seemed to hold its breath when the stepmother entered. She ruled with a quiet cruelty, preferring small cuts of humiliation over loud punishments. Her whispers became rumors that spread in the market, her cold glares silenced conversations. Yet despite her efforts to keep the household in her grip, she could not choke the sound of the girl's voice. It floated through the air no matter how many tasks she piled upon her, no matter how harsh the words she spat at her. The girl would still find moments to sing, even if softly, even if just to herself, because her voice was the one thing no one could take away. The villagers began to wonder if the girl's songs came from something greater than human. Some said her late mother had left her spirit within the child's throat. Others believed the ancestors had gifted her a voice that could soothe suffering. Whatever the truth, it became clear that her stepmother could no longer tolerate it. With every passing day, the hatred grew sharper, pressing against her like a blade waiting to strike. And though the girl herself sensed the coldness in her stepmother's eyes, she could never have imagined how far that hatred would go. For within the House of Silence, a cruel plan was forming, one that sought not only to end her songs but to erase her very voice from the world. Yet whispers travel and walls remember. And though the stepmother plotted in secret, the house itself seemed to shiver with unease, as if it knew that what was about to happen would turn silence into something much louder, something eternal. For silence, once forced, has a way of echoing back, and her stepmother would soon learn that a voice born from purity cannot be destroyed, it can only find new places to live. From the moment she was old enough to walk barefoot through the dust and carry small bundles of firewood on her head, the girl had been known for her voice. It wasn't the sort of voice one simply heard, it was the kind that lingered, the kind that filled the air with something weightless and bright. When she sang, it was as though the heaviness of the world briefly lifted, and even those bent under the burdens of poverty or grief found themselves breathing easier. She would hum while sweeping the cracked floor of the house, and the rhythm of her song would turn the mundane scrape of broom against ground into something gentle and almost sacred. She would sing while pounding grain, her voice rising above the dull thud of the pestle, making the task seem less about survival and more about connection. In the market, where voices often rose in harsh bargaining and laughter sometimes masked cruelty, her singing was a different kind of sound. It flowed like cool water on a hot day, soft yet carrying far, as though the air itself wanted to carry her gift from stall to stall. Merchants would pause mid-shout, tilting their heads toward the melody. Women burdened with baskets would smile without realizing it. Children, restless and noisy, would gather around her, their games momentarily forgotten. "That child's voice can heal sorrow," one old woman often whispered. Even the ancestors must pause when she sings. Her songs were not simply notes, they were woven with memory and meaning. Many of the melodies she sang had been taught to her by her late father. He had been a quiet man with little wealth but a heart full of stories and songs. In the evenings, when the village was cloaked in firelight and shadows, he would sing to her, his voice deep and steady. He had told her once, pressing his calloused hand to her small chest, "When I am gone, child, you will still carry me here. Every song I have sung will live inside you." She had not understood the weight of those words at the time, but as she grew and loss settled into her bones, his voice remained alive each time she opened her mouth to sing. The villagers often said they could hear not just her, but the echo of her father, a reminder of a man who had left too soon yet was never truly gone. She sang for herself as much as for others. On days when the cruelty of her stepmother pressed down heavily, she would retreat to the riverbank or the shade of a baobab tree and let her voice free. The water seemed to shimmer differently when she sang, the leaves trembled as if they understood, and even the smallest birds drew nearer. Her voice was her sanctuary, her resistance, her way of affirming that despite the harshness of life, something within her remained untouched, unbroken. The villagers began to believe her voice carried blessings. When a mother lost her child, the girl sang at the burial, and people swore the wails of grief softened as her song rose over the grave. When harvests failed and the ground cracked with thirst, her voice was lifted in prayerful song, and though rain did not always follow, hearts felt steadier, as if her melody itself was rain for the spirit. Those who quarreled found their anger cooled in her presence, for it was difficult to hold rage when such gentleness filled the air. But her voice was not just admired, it was treasured. In a world where wealth was measured in cattle, coins, or cloth, the girl's wealth was intangible, yet it was priceless. For those who listened, it was a gift beyond gold. And that was precisely what made her stepmother's heart knot tighter each day. The girl's singing cast light into places her stepmother wanted to keep dark. It brought attention to the girl, admiration she had not earned with riches but been born with, and it made the stepmother feel invisible. Still, the girl continued to sing, not out of pride but because it was as natural to her as breathing. She sang because her father's memory lived in every note, because the villagers' smiles gave her strength, because silence felt like erasure and she refused to disappear. Her songs stitched her to the world around her, people, earth and ancestors alike. Little did she know that this very gift, this brightness that bound her to life, was also what would provoke her stepmother into an act of cruelty so dark that it would change the meaning of her voice forever. Envy does not always roar. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, settling in the corners of a heart until it becomes impossible to ignore. For the girl's stepmother, envy had begun as a small discomfort, a sting each time she overheard the villagers praising the girl's singing. Her voice brings peace, they would say. Her songs are gifts from the ancestors. At first, the stepmother dismissed these words with a tight smile, telling herself it was only chatter. But with every passing season, the words grew louder in her mind, until they felt like needles beneath her skin. She could not bear how the girl's voice made her beloved by the villagers while she, the mistress of the house, went unnoticed. What had the girl done to deserve such adoration? She had no riches, no beauty of rare measure, no authority. And yet her voice alone was enough to make people pause, to soften their hearts, to treat her with a respect the stepmother had never been given. To the stepmother, this was an unforgivable imbalance. In her twisted view, the girl was stealing admiration that did not belong to her, casting a shadow over her stepmother's authority both inside and outside the household. Bitterness soon turned to obsession. The stepmother began to scrutinize the girl's every movement, her every word. If the girl sang while grinding grain, the stepmother muttered that she was trying to attract attention. If she sang at the riverbank, the stepmother accused her of flaunting her gift. Even the girl's silence became suspicious, as if she were plotting to make herself seem more saintly by comparison. Every action, no matter how innocent, fed the stepmother's growing resentment. Her jealousy was not something she kept to herself. She began to whisper venom into her daughter's ears, pouring her bitterness like poison into the girl's stepsister's heart. "Do you not see how she tries to outshine you?" she would murmur late at night. "Her songs make the villagers forget you exist. When they smile at her, they are mocking you. When they praise her, they are saying you are nothing." The stepsister, who had once felt only mild irritation toward her sibling, began to believe the words. She started to notice how the villagers never praised her clothes or her laugh but always spoke of her stepsister's voice. She began to hate the sound of singing, not because it lacked beauty but because it reminded her of her own invisibility. Together, mother and daughter built a web of resentment, each strand spun from lies and comparisons. The house grew thick with it, a place once warmed by the girl's songs now heavy with tension. The stepmother would sit in the shadows, her eyes glinting like coals whenever the girl hummed, her lips twitching in suppressed anger. The stepsister would scowl, covering her ears or storming away, muttering insults about cursed voices and false sweetness. Yet the more they tried to dismiss or belittle her, the more the villagers' admiration grew, and with it, the flames of their envy burned hotter. The girl herself noticed the change but could not fully understand it. She felt the weight of their stares, the sharpness of their words, the chill that filled the house when she lifted her voice. Still, she continued to sing because her voice was her solace, her link to her father, her way of remembering that not all was cruelty in her life. But in the stepmother's eyes, every song became defiance, every note a challenge, every melody a reminder that she could not control the one thing that mattered most. Whispers of envy turned into muttered threats. The stepmother would hiss under her breath, words sharp as broken glass. "One day you will regret opening that mouth." The stepsister, emboldened by her mother's poison, added her own cruelty, mocking the girl, mimicking her voice in cruel parodies, calling her the bird who sings for crumbs. Together they turned the home into a cage of resentment. The girl's voice, once a source of harmony, now echoed against walls thick with hostility. The villagers too noticed the change. They saw the stepmother's forced smiles, the stepsister's bitterness, and they whispered about envy festering in that household. But no one dared intervene. Envy, after all, was like smoke. It could choke a home yet slip through cracks unseen. What the villagers did not realize was that envy, if left unchecked, could also ignite into fire, burning everything in its path. And within the stepmother's heart, that fire had already begun to blaze. It was no longer enough to despise the girl's voice. She wanted to silence it. She wanted to erase it. She wanted to make sure that no song ever escaped those lips again. The night was heavy with an unsettling stillness, as though the very air in the house sensed what was about to unfold. The girl, as she always did, had been humming softly to herself while tidying the dimly lit rooms, her song weaving comfort into walls that otherwise carried little warmth. But in the shadows, her stepmother's envy had festered into something no longer controllable. Every note the girl had sung, every smile it had earned from passers-by, had deepened the woman's bitterness until it was no longer mere resentment, it had become venom. That night, the stepmother followed her like a predator tracking prey. The girl, innocent and unaware, turned when she heard her stepmother's steps echo against the wooden floor, expecting perhaps another harsh word or demand. But what stared back at her was not the usual scowl, it was a twisted mask of rage, eyes blazing with an envy that had consumed all reason. The woman cornered her near the small wooden table, her hands trembling not from fear but from the violence she was determined to unleash. Words spat from her lips, accusations that the girl had stolen love, stolen attention, stolen even the memory of the father who once cherished her. The girl tried to shake her head, tears brimming, but no denial could be heard, for the stepmother would not listen. In that moment of blind cruelty, the stepmother seized her. The girl's cry barely rose before it was smothered by the hand that clamped across her mouth. With the other, the woman lifted the gleam of a blade, sharp and cold under the flickering lamp. The girl's eyes widened in terror, but mercy was absent in the heart before her. Then came the act, swift, brutal, irreversible. The steel cut through the soft flesh of innocence, silencing the very gift that had filled the home with light. A muffled scream broke into the night, so full of pain it seemed to shake the rafters. The girl's body writhed in shock, her tears streaming like rivers, her song stolen in one savage moment. Blood poured onto the wooden floor, staining it with the memory of violence that would never wash away. The blade clattered against the table when the act was done, but the sound was drowned in the suffocating weight of silence that followed. The girl collapsed to her knees, clutching her mouth, gasping, but no words, no song, no melody emerged. Only a hollow silence that seemed louder than any cry could ever be. The stepmother stood above her, panting, her chest heaving as though she had slain a great beast, but in truth she had struck down a child. Her hatred had silenced a voice, but in that silence, a darker presence seemed to stir, one the woman herself could not name. The room felt colder, as though unseen eyes were watching, as though the walls themselves recoiled at the horror they had been forced to witness. The stepmother, still gripping her bloodied hands, tried to steady her breath, but even she felt it. The silence was not ordinary. It was the silence of something broken, something sacred that should never have been touched. The girl lay trembling, her eyes burning with pain and betrayal, but within her, though her tongue was gone, her spirit did not die. Somewhere in that heavy, blood-stained silence, her voice still lingered, though not in the way the stepmother expected. The house was never the same after that night. Where once it had echoed with soft melodies drifting from the girl's lips, there was now only a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. The girl, whose voice had been her soul's offering to the world, sat with swollen eyes and trembling hands, her mouth bandaged and raw. She tried to hum, tried to let some fragment of her spirit escape, but nothing came. Her voice was gone, carved away by cruelty, leaving her a prisoner in her own silence. Her stepmother, however, carried herself with triumphant arrogance. In her mind she had won. No longer would the girl's songs drift out into the streets, drawing neighbors and villagers to pause and listen. No longer would whispers of her beauty and grace fill the market. Now she is nothing, the stepmother sneered to herself, striding through the house as though she were queen of its emptiness. She believed she had silenced not just the girl's voice, but her very essence. The stepsister joined in the mockery, repeating cruel jests to her mother. She cannot sing now, she cannot even beg for mercy. What good is she? Their laughter echoed through the halls, but it was hollow, brittle, the sound of triumph too sharp to last. They thought the girl's silence was weakness, but they had not noticed the subtle shift that began to creep through the house. For the home itself, built from wood that had absorbed every song she had ever sung, seemed to mourn her loss. The walls, once warmed by melodies, now groaned faintly in the night as if grieving. The floor, stained by her blood, creaked with sorrow whenever her bare feet moved across it. Even the wind that slipped through the cracks no longer whistled cheerfully. Instead, it carried a strange, low hum, as if trying to give voice to the sound the girl could no longer make. The girl felt this too. Though her throat burned and her tongue was gone, when she pressed her hand to the walls, she could almost hear faint echoes, remnants of her old songs, carried in the memory of the house. It was as though her spirit had not been silenced, only transformed, lingering in places her stepmother could not reach. She closed her eyes often, letting her tears fall, and in those tears she felt something stir. Grief, yes, but also strength. For though she could not speak, her presence remained, and the house itself seemed to take up her sorrow as its own. At night, when all should have been still, strange things began to happen. The stepmother would hear a faint hum in the walls, so soft she could not be sure if it was real. She would clutch her shawl tighter and dismiss it as wind, yet unease settled in her bones. Once as she lay in bed, she swore she heard a voice, faint and wordless, drifting from the very ceiling above her. She rose, pacing the floor, her heart beating faster than she wished to admit. She had silenced the girl, yet the silence was not the peace she had expected. It was a silence that breathed, a silence that watched. The stepsister too began to feel it. When she mocked the girl in passing, her own words seemed to echo strangely, bouncing off the walls and coming back twisted, as if the house itself disapproved. She would run back to her mother, unsettled, but the stepmother would hush her with sharp words. It is nothing. The house creaks. Do not let your mind invent ghosts. But the girl knew better. She could feel it, her voice was gone yet not gone. Where her tongue could no longer shape words, the house itself had begun to carry her essence, as though the spirit of her songs had seeped into every corner. The timbers, the stones, even the air seemed alive with something her stepmother could neither silence nor control. The stepmother continued to gloat, parading her false victory. She forced the girl to work harder than ever, mocking her muteness, enjoying the cruel game of asking questions only to laugh at the silence that followed. Yet every time she laughed, the house seemed to groan louder as though bearing witness. At night, when the girl wept into her pillow, the soundless cries seemed to seep into the floor, and sometimes when the stepmother passed that room, she swore she heard faint sobs though the girl's lips made none. Days passed into weeks and the house grew stranger still. Dishes rattled faintly without reason. Doors creaked open as if stirred by an unseen hand. The stepmother told herself it was only the wind, only her imagination, but the truth gnawed at her. She had tried to destroy a voice, but voices do not die so easily. They linger, they echo, they find new homes when flesh is too fragile to contain them. The girl, though wounded and grieving, began to draw strength from this. She could not sing as she once did, but when she walked through the house, she felt accompanied as though her songs were walking beside her. She would press her hand to the walls and close her eyes, and in that silence she found a strange comfort. She was mute but she was not alone. The house mourned with her. And in mourning, it had become something more, something alive, something that whispered to her heart. Her voice was not gone. At first it was only a breath, a soft ripple in the night that seemed too faint to matter. The girl lay on her thin mat in the corner of the room, her body weak, her lips motionless, yet the air itself seemed to tremble with something half-remembered. It was a whisper at first, a sigh caught between wood and stone, as though the house were exhaling all the grief it had swallowed. She pressed her ear to the wall, and though her throat burned with silence, she heard it, her song. It was not strong, not yet. A faint melody, carried low and broken, like the memory of music rather than the music itself. But it was there. The lullaby she used to hum while gathering water, the tune she had sung when her father would smile at her from the doorway. Her heart leapt painfully in her chest, for she had thought her voice gone forever, stolen and buried by cruelty. Yet here it was, returned to her in the strange breathing of the house, echoing from walls and corners as though they themselves had become her throat. At first she thought she was dreaming. She sat up, pressing her bandaged mouth, willing herself to believe she was not imagining it. But when she stilled her breath, the sound continued, faint and persistent. Her song lived. Her voice had not died, it had only found a new home. And in that moment, despite her pain, she wept with something close to joy. The stepmother, however, did not weep. That night she was stirred from her sleep by a sound that should not have been. A faint hum drifted from the corridor outside her room. She stiffened, clutching her blanket. For a moment she thought perhaps the girl had dared to sing again, but then she remembered the tongue. She herself had cut it, watched the blood stain the floor. The girl could not make a sound if she tried. Yet here it was, a voice like mist in the night, rising and falling like a gentle breeze. She rose, pacing the hallway with a candle in hand, the flame flickering as if uneasy. "Who is there?" she whispered sharply, though the silence of the house gave her no answer. Still, the humming continued, and she swore it came from the very walls themselves. She pressed her palm against the wood, her face pale in the candlelight, and for the briefest moment she thought she felt the vibration of song beneath her hand. She drew back quickly, her heart racing. "It is nothing," she muttered. "It is only the wind." But the words tasted hollow in her mouth. The stepsister too noticed. Lying in her bed, she heard a melody slip through the cracks of her window, a tune she knew too well, the same the girl had once sung while weaving baskets. She pulled the blanket over her head, trembling. "Mother," she whispered the next morning, "the house is singing." But the stepmother struck her cheek with the back of her hand. "Foolish child. Do not speak such nonsense. You frighten yourself with shadows." Yet even as she spoke, her eyes flickered with fear. The girl, though, understood. She did not tell them, she could not, but she knew. Her voice had returned, not through her lips but through the walls themselves. When she walked through the rooms, she felt accompanied by a chorus of herself, faint and gentle, like a shadow of her spirit singing alongside her. She would sit by the hearth, tracing the cracks in the stones, and the faint echoes would gather there, as though the house had learned to remember her every note and release them when silence grew too heavy. It was not only at night. As days passed, the echoes grew bolder. When the girl touched the wooden beams, sometimes the sound would rise, a faint hum like the strum of a distant harp. When she walked barefoot across the floor, she felt vibrations hum beneath her feet. Once, when she brushed her hand across a wall in sorrow, a soft melody emerged, carrying the very tune she had wished to sing. It was as though her voice, once cut away, had seeped into every board, every nail, every stone, waiting for moments to release itself again. The villagers began to notice. Those who passed by the house at night swore they heard a faint, haunting singing drifting from within. It was not loud enough to be clear, but enough to make them pause, to draw their brows together in unease. "That house mourns," one whispered. "It mourns or it speaks." Word spread and rumors grew like weeds. Some claimed the girl's voice was still alive. Some whispered that the ancestors themselves had taken pity on her and given her song to the walls. Others muttered darker tales, that a curse had been laid on the family, that the house would not rest until the stepmother's sin was paid in full. The stepmother grew restless. Each night, the echoes grew stronger, each day the whispers louder. She tried to drown it with harsh words and cruel tasks, ordering the girl to scrub floors until her hands blistered, to fetch water until her body ached. But no matter how much cruelty she poured into the girl's life, the echoes only seemed to multiply. The girl's lips were mute, but the house had become her choir. The stepsister, once proud in her mother's shadow, now shrank in fear. She avoided walking alone through the corridors, for the walls seemed to sigh when she passed, as if condemning her. She slept poorly, waking to the faint sound of songs brushing against her ears like unseen hands. She covered her head, but no cloth could block the music that seeped from wood and stone. And the girl, though broken, though tongueless, felt a strange strength grow within her. The house itself had taken her side. Every whisper, every echo reminded her that she was not erased. Her voice had become something greater than flesh, greater than cruelty. It had become eternal, lodged in every wall and beam, carried by air and stone, and no hand could silence it again. The stepmother had cut her tongue, but she had only freed the voice to rise elsewhere. And now, in the hush of night, that voice echoed softly, filling the house with both sorrow and defiance, until silence itself seemed to tremble. It began as faint whispers, but soon the house itself seemed to breathe with her voice. The beams overhead, the stones in the hearth, the floorboards beneath bare feet, Every part of the house carried the sound of her songs as though it had swallowed her memory and refused to keep it hidden. By day the echoes were subtle, a low hum trembling along the walls when the girl moved through them, as though the house greeted her with soft remembrance. But by night the voices grew bold, filling every shadow with melody. The stepmother first noticed when she awoke to what she thought was the sound of wind passing through the shutters. But the sound did not fade like wind. It grew clearer, shaping into a lullaby the girl had once sung while grinding millet by the fire. The stepmother sat upright, her body stiff, listening as the notes rose from the darkness, not from lips, not from any living throat, but from the very walls. She pressed her hands over her ears, yet the song slipped through, weaving itself into her bones until her skin prickled with dread. She muttered prayers, but her words drowned beneath the music that seemed to know no end. The stepsister too began to tremble. She could not bear to sleep alone anymore. She swore that when she closed her eyes, a soft humming pressed against her ears, sometimes from the rafters above her, sometimes from beneath the bed itself. One night she woke gasping, certain she felt warm breath against her cheek. When she opened her eyes, there was nothing but shadow, and yet the melody lingered, the same one the girl had sung when braiding her father's fishing nets. Her body shivered with cold sweat, and she fled to her mother's side, clutching her tightly. But even there the voice followed, slipping through cracks and corners like water seeking its path. The girl herself moved silently, her lips sealed, yet wherever she walked the echoes stirred. When she sat by the fire, the flames seemed to crackle in rhythm with her lost songs. When she washed clothes at the basin, the water rippled to melodies that had once lived in her throat. She felt no fear in this. To her, it was as though her spirit had been freed from flesh, and the house had chosen to carry her voice when she could not. The cruelty done to her body had not erased her, but instead multiplied her presence until it filled every space her stepmother claimed as her own. The villagers soon began to notice. At first, it was only those who passed the house at dusk, carrying baskets of grain or returning from the fields. They slowed their steps, hearing what they swore was singing, though no one stood outside. The windows glowed faintly with lamplight, but the song seemed to seep from the very walls, humming into the air. "Did you hear it?" one would whisper. "Her voice. I thought she could not speak." Another would shiver and reply, "Perhaps it is not she who sings but the house itself." Curiosity spread, as it always did in a village where whispers traveled faster than wind. Some came closer at night, daring to step into the shadows near the house. What they heard chilled their bones. Lullabies, gentle and sweet, weaving through the air as if sung by a mother to a child. Others swore they heard chants, low and steady, like the voices of ancestors rising in harmony. The sound shifted with each ear, sometimes mournful, sometimes soothing, sometimes sharp enough to cut silence into pieces. No two people heard the same song, yet all agreed. The house sang, and it was the girl's voice that filled it. Rumors grew. Some said she had been blessed by spirits, her voice made eternal by the ancestors who had seen her suffering. Others whispered darker tales, that her silence had turned into a curse, that the house itself had become her tongue, echoing her grief until the family who wronged her would be driven mad. The stepmother, hearing these whispers, raged in secret. She told the villagers to stop their foolish talk, that the girl was mute and nothing more. Yet when she returned to her home, the music waited for her, pouring from walls, from stones, from the very roof that sheltered her. It was no longer just at night. The voices began to swell during the day, weaving into the rhythm of work. When pots clanged together, her song slipped between the sounds. When a broom swept across the floor, the bristles seemed to hum with faint melody. Even when silence was demanded, the house refused to obey. It pulsed with her presence, her voice unbroken, unyielding. The stepmother tried to drown it out. She struck the girl, ordering her to stay in the yard, far from the walls. Yet even then the echoes followed, slipping through wood and air alike, carrying her voice back into the rooms. She tried to burn incense, thinking smoke might choke the sound, but the scent only carried the echoes farther. Once, in her desperation, she pressed her ear to the ground outside, hoping for quiet, and still she heard it, soft and endless, humming beneath the soil as though the earth itself had joined the chorus. The stepsister, once proud and mocking, now wept at night. She begged her mother to make it stop. "Her voice is everywhere," she cried. "Even in my dreams it follows me. I cannot sleep, I cannot breathe without hearing her songs." But the stepmother could not silence it. She had stolen a tongue, but in doing so she had freed something far greater. The house had become an instrument, and every corner sang with the girl's spirit. The villagers gathered more often now, standing just beyond the gates, listening in awe. They shook their heads and crossed themselves, whispering that they had never heard such a thing in all their lives. Some wept quietly, moved by the beauty of the sound. Others bowed their heads, muttering that it was a warning, that no cruelty ever went unseen. And though the girl remained mute, she felt her strength grow with every whisper carried by the walls. Her voice had become eternal, and no hand, not even her stepmother's, could cut it away again. The stepmother's heart grew restless as the days passed, her nights broken into fragments of shallow sleep and jolted awakenings. Every time she thought she had silenced the voice, it returned, stronger, louder, carrying not just melody but a power that pressed against her chest like a heavy hand. The once proud woman who had strutted through the village with her head high now walked with quickened steps, her eyes darting at shadows, as though even the air whispered with the girl's stolen voice. Her first attempt at silence was with charms. She went to an old woman at the edge of the village, one who sold herbs and carved wooden figures. With trembling fingers she bought pouches of ash and salt, binding them with red thread. She hung them in the corners of the house, muttering words the woman had taught her, commands for silence, words meant to bind spirits. She placed a charm under the girl's bed, another above the doorway, and sprinkled ash across the floor. That night she lay waiting, certain that the echoes would be gone. But the house betrayed her. As soon as darkness fell, the lullabies began again, this time swelling so thickly in the air that the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. The charms dangled uselessly, swaying as if mocked by unseen hands. The salt turned damp, and the ash scattered across the floor was swept into a circle by the breath of the echoes. She clutched her head and screamed, but the screams only mixed with the music, making it rise louder, purer, as though the voice rejoiced in her torment. She tried fire next. In her desperation, she carried a burning torch from room to room, pressing the flame against the wooden beams and muttering that she would scorch the sound out of the walls. But the fire only hissed and guttered, smoke curling upward as if pushed back by something greater. The echoes did not fade. Instead, the song changed, growing into chants like a chorus of voices, not just the girls, but many layered upon each other, women and men, young and old, all joining in harmony. It was as though every ancestor of the girl had awakened, their voices wrapping around the stepmother, condemning her with every note. The villagers began to notice her unraveling. She stumbled through the market with her hair untidy, muttering curses under her breath. When people asked if she was well, she snapped at them, her voice cracked and sharp. The once respected woman who had boasted of her wealth and power now looked haunted. Whispers spread quickly, "The voice is driving her mad," they said. She cut the girl's tongue, and now the spirits sing in her place. Some shook their heads in pity, others smirked, saying it was no more than she deserved. At home, the stepmother's cruelty grew sharper, but also more desperate. She struck the girl for the smallest of reasons, her rage flaring whenever she saw the calmness in her stepdaughter's eyes. The girl, mute but unbroken, carried herself with a quiet strength that only deepened the stepmother's fear. The woman hissed at her, demanding to know how she controlled the voices. She grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, demanding silence. But the girl only stared, her lips closed, her eyes steady. And the walls answered in her stead, filling the room with song until the stepmother recoiled, her nails digging into her palms. Her sleep was no longer her own. Each night, she tossed and turned as the house filled with voices. Sometimes she woke gasping, convinced that a chorus of whispers was breathing against her skin. Sometimes she swore she felt the vibrations of the songs pulsing through the bed frame, as though the very wood beneath her was alive. Her daughter clung to her, whimpering that she could not stand the endless music. The stepmother, who had once believed she held power over the household, now realized the house itself belonged to the girl. One evening, in a final act of desperation, she gathered every charm, every token, every scrap of power she thought might save her. She burned incense until the air choked, drew lines of ash along the walls, and sprinkled salt in thick circles around the girl. "This is my house," she cried, her voice breaking into shrieks. "You will not haunt me. You will not sing here." She stomped her feet, tore at her hair, and slammed her fists against the walls. But the echoes only grew louder, steady and unyielding, drowning her voice in their rising tide. And then something happened that shook her to her core. For the first time, the echoes did not come from the walls, they came from within her own chest. She froze, her hand pressed against her body, feeling vibrations beneath her ribs. The girl's song slipped through her throat though her lips never moved, the sound clawing its way out of her. She clamped her hands over her mouth and screamed, but her scream only layered upon the melody, becoming part of it. She crumpled to the floor, weeping in terror, realizing the truth. She had not silenced the girl. She had only unleashed her voice into every surface, every corner, every breath. Her cruelty had not destroyed the song. It had given it endless reach. No hand, no fire, no charm could bind it again. And the stepmother knew, though she had cut flesh, though she had stolen words, she no longer held control. The girl's voice belonged to the house, to the air, to the ancestors themselves. And now it was beyond her forever. When the season of celebration arrived, the village gathered for its grandest event, the Festival of Voices. It was a time when every family came together to share songs, dances, and stories passed down from ancestors. Drums rolled in the distance, children painted their faces with clay and chalk, and women wore their brightest wrappers, their heads crowned with beads. The festival was not only for merriment, it was a sacred acknowledgement of sound as a gift from the spirits. To sing during the festival was to speak with the ancestors themselves. But on this year, as the people filled the central square, something strange stirred in the air. The stepmother, clad in garish cloth, tried to blend into the joyous crowd with her daughter beside her. She laughed loudly, clapped her hands, and pretended to rejoice, though her heart was trembling. For nights on end she had heard the cursed echoes in her house, the girl's voice slipping through walls, drifting from corners, spilling from the very air. She had tried to crush it, to burn herbs and mutter charms, but the songs only grew louder. Now, as the drums beat in the open square, she prayed that the festival would drown out those sounds. Yet fate had decided otherwise. As the elders gathered to open the ceremony, the first song was expected to come from the youngest of the village children. A boy stepped forward, holding his drum ready to sing. But before he could strike the first note, a ripple of sound rose from the stepmother's house on the hill. Clear, haunting, and impossibly beautiful, the girl's voice poured forth, not from her lips, but from the very bones of the house that had once imprisoned her songs. The echoes rushed out like a tide, sweeping across the festival square. The girl herself, standing quietly at the edge, lowered her head, but the crowd gasped, recognizing instantly whose voice it was. The sound was not ordinary. It was layered with memory, with sorrow, with the tenderness she had once given freely to her chores, to her father's memory, to the village. It carried lullabies that mothers hummed to their babies, chants that farmers muttered in their fields, melodies that eased pain and sorrow. It was as though the walls themselves had learned her songs and now declared them to the world. The crowd fell silent, every man, woman, and child struck still as the voice expanded, echoing over rooftops and through the open sky. Then the truth unfolded in the song itself. For though no tongue moved, the echoes shaped words that spoke of betrayal, cruelty, and blood on the floor of a silent house. The people heard it as if the ancestors themselves were bearing witness. They saw, in the voice, the injustice of a girl robbed of her tongue, and they shuddered as the melody turned into a lament so sorrowful that even the trees seemed to bend in grief. The stepmother and her daughter clutched each other, their faces pale, for the crowd had turned to look at them, eyes narrowing with anger and disgust. Children began to cry, not out of fear but because the voice was too heavy with pain. Mothers held their children close, murmuring that no innocent should ever suffer such cruelty. The elders stood in grim silence, their walking sticks pressed firmly into the earth. One of them, the oldest woman of the council, raised her hand and said, "This is not the sound of the living alone. This is the sound of spirits telling us truth." Her words only confirmed what everyone already knew. The stepmother's crime had been exposed before the entire village. Shouts erupted. Men demanded justice. Women shook their heads in sorrow but pointed accusingly at the stepmother. Children who once mocked the girl now looked upon her with awe, realizing her silence had never been weakness, it had been turned into power. The girl's songs filled the air until every corner of the village seemed alive with them, echoing off walls, through rafters, and even in the trees. The stepmother fell to her knees, covering her ears, screaming that it was lies, but the crowd had no patience for her words. They had heard the truth with their own ears. The girl, though silent in body, had spoken with 1,000 voices. What her stepmother had cut away had returned with the strength of spirits, magnified, undeniable. That day the Festival of Voices ceased to be only about ancestors and celebration. It became the day a girl's stolen tongue gave birth to a legacy of truth and justice. The festival square, still heavy with the echoes of the girl's song, grew silent as the elders stepped forward. Their presence carried the weight of tradition, for in times of great dispute, it was the elders who spoke on behalf of the ancestors. Each of them was dressed in garments marked with sacred beads and cowrie shells, their staffs carved with symbols of power and wisdom. The crowd parted in reverence as they moved to the center. The air itself seemed to hush, waiting for their verdict. The eldest of them, a man whose beard was white as chalk and whose eyes carried the stillness of rivers, raised his staff high. "What we have heard today," he began, his voice trembling not with weakness but with awe, "is no ordinary song. These are the echoes of the ancestors themselves, carried through the suffering of this girl." His hand motioned gently toward her. She stood at the edge of the square, her lips closed, her eyes downcast, yet the air still thrummed faintly with her presence, as though her voice refused to leave. The old woman among the elders, known as Mother Kanda, stepped forward next. Her gaze fell heavily on the stepmother. "You sought to silence innocence. You sought to cut away the gift that the ancestors themselves had placed in her. You thought yourself greater than the spirits. But see what has become of your cruelty. Her voice lives in the walls, in the earth, in the very air we breathe. You cannot cut what is divine." Her words struck like lightning, and the people murmured in agreement, nodding and clicking their tongues in disgust at the stepmother. The council then gathered their voices together, declaring as one that the girl was chosen. "The ancestors have made her their vessel," they proclaimed. "Though her tongue is gone, her voice has been multiplied. Where one song was once sung, now countless echoes live on. This is not the work of man, it is the work of the unseen powers, who guard the innocent and expose the wicked." The stepmother fell to the ground, wailing, clutching at her garments as if to hide from the eyes of the people. But the elders' faces remained stern. "Your act is unforgivable," they told her. "You brought blood into the house not as sacrifice to the spirits, but as cruelty against your own child. And now you stand stripped of honor, condemned not only by us, but by the very voice you tried to destroy." The villagers spat on the earth before her, a sign of rejection, while children clung to their mothers, whispering that the woman's heart was blacker than night. Turning back to the girl, the elders stretched their hands over her head. A hush fell across the festival as they spoke their blessing. "Daughter of song, vessel of the unseen, you are a living shrine. The ancestors breathe through you, and no blade, no hatred, no envy shall silence what has been made eternal. Though your tongue is gone, your spirit sings forever. Wherever your feet walk, the echoes of your voice will follow, a shield against cruelty and a light for the oppressed." Tears ran down the faces of many villagers as they listened, for they felt the truth of the blessing in their bones. Even the girl, though she could not speak, lifted her face toward the sky, her eyes shining with quiet strength. It was as though, in that moment, she accepted not only her suffering but also the power it had birthed. She was no longer just a girl with a stolen tongue, she had become the very embodiment of the ancestors' justice.